It was supposed to be a simple winter getaway, just 4 friends seeking adventure in the wild, snow-covered forests of Colorado. The plan was to camp for 2 nights in a remote area known for its breathtaking beauty and, occasionally, eerie stories. Jake, Emma, Tyler, and Lisa arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they trudged through the woods, the pale winter sun already dipping behind the trees. By the time they reached a clearing to set up their tents, the forest was bathed in twilight. The first night was uneventful, save for the bitter cold. They laughed, shared stories, and huddled close around the fire, their breath visible in the freezing air. Around midnight, they retreated to their tents, the forest silent except for the occasional crack of distant ice. But the silence didn't last. At around 3 a.m., Jake was jolted awake by a sound. At first, he thought it was the wind. But as he strained his ears, he realized it was something else, something dragging through the snow. He held his breath, listening. The sound grew louder, then stopped just outside their tent. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered to Tyler, who was sharing the tent with him. "Yeah," Tyler replied, his voice barely audible. "It's probably just an animal." But Jake wasn't convinced. The sound didn't move like an animal. It was deliberate, almost human. Suddenly, Lisa screamed from her tent. Jake and Tyler scrambled out into the freezing night. Lisa and Emma were outside, clutching each other, their faces pale. "There was a shadow," Lisa stammered. "Right there by the trees. It was watching us." Jake scanned the forest with his flashlight, but the beam illuminated only snow and skeletal branches. No footprints. No sign of anything or anyone. They decided to stay together in one tent for the rest of the night, but sleep was impossible. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a warning. By morning, they were eager to leave. As they packed, Tyler froze, staring at the edge of the clearing. "Guys," he whispered. In the snow, there were tracks, large, uneven footprints leading into the woods. But they didn't come from the forest. They started right in the middle of the clearing, as if something had appeared out of thin air. The 4 stood frozen, staring at the footprints. They were wide and misshapen, unlike anything they had seen before. Jake crouched down to examine them more closely. "These aren't from a bear," he muttered, his breath visible in the icy air. "The spacing. It's too far apart, almost like someone was jumping. But who could be out here in this cold, barefoot?" "No one," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "No one sane." The decision was unanimous. They'd pack quickly and leave. Emma began rolling up the tents while Lisa kept watch. Jake and Tyler busied themselves gathering their scattered gear, but unease hung heavy in the air. As they worked, Emma suddenly stopped. "Guys," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They turned to see her standing by the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. She pointed to the footprints. "They're fresh," she said. "They weren't here earlier this morning." Panic set in. The footprints hadn't just appeared, they were being made. Someone, or something, was out there, moving silently through the woods. Jake took out his phone, desperate for a signal, but the screen showed no bars. Tyler gripped the small hatchet they'd brought for firewood, his knuckles white. "We're leaving. Now," Jake said firmly. The group didn't bother with breakfast. They threw their gear into their packs, leaving some behind in their haste. As they started back toward the trailhead, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. About half an hour into the hike, Lisa, who was at the back of the group, let out a sharp gasp. Everyone turned. "Look," she whispered, pointing back toward the trail. Through the trees, barely visible against the snow, was a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, partially obscured by the shadows. "Is that a person?" Emma asked. Jake squinted. The figure seemed too tall, its proportions slightly off. The longer he looked, the more unsettling it became. "Keep walking," he said, his voice firm. "Don't stop." The group picked up their pace, the figure vanishing from view as they rounded a bend. But the sense of dread only grew. As they neared the trailhead, the wind picked up, carrying with it an eerie sound, a low, guttural moan that echoed through the trees. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. When they finally reached their car, they practically threw themselves inside, locking the doors behind them. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling, and started the engine. As they pulled away, Lisa glanced out the rear window. Her face went pale. "It's there," she whispered. Jake couldn't bring himself to look, but Emma and Tyler turned. Standing at the edge of the tree line was the figure. It wasn't chasing them. It didn't need to. It was watching. They drove in silence, not stopping until they reached the nearest town. None of them spoke about what they'd seen that night, but the memories lingered like a frost that refused to thaw. Later, when Jake tried to look up the area online, he found something chilling. Several similar stories, dating back decades. Campers hearing strange noises, seeing footprints that appeared from nowhere, and spotting figures just beyond the tree line. The most unsettling detail? No one ever saw it up close, and no one ever stayed long enough to find out what it was. Back in town, the group checked into a small roadside motel. The warmth inside should have felt comforting, but the unease lingered like a shadow. They sat in silence, sipping coffee from styrofoam cups. Finally, Tyler broke the quiet. What do you think that was?" he asked, staring at the steam rising from his cup. "Not a person," Lisa said immediately, her voice flat. Jake hesitated. He wanted to say it was just a strange trick of the light or maybe an unusual animal, but deep down, he didn't believe it. The footprints, the figure's height, and the unrelenting sense of being watched, none of it added up. "I don't know," Jake finally admitted. "But I'm not going back there to find out." They agreed to leave the area the next morning. The forest was miles behind them, but it didn't feel far enough. That night, Jake woke with a start. The motel room was silent except for the faint hum of the heater, but something had roused him. He lay there, heart pounding, listening. Then he heard it. A faint, dragging sound. It wasn't inside the room, but just outside, near the window. Slowly, Jake sat up, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The curtain was drawn, but a sliver of moonlight spilled in around the edges. He debated waking the others, but stopped when he noticed a shadow pass across the thin gap between the curtains. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though whatever was outside was taking its time. Jake's breath caught. The shadow paused directly in front of the window. He reached for his phone, but his hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. Turning on the flashlight felt too risky, so instead, he carefully opened the camera app and aimed it at the window, hoping to catch whatever was outside. The screen showed nothing but the pale curtain and faint light. He waited, his thumb hovering over the button to snap a photo. But then the shadow moved away, disappearing as suddenly as it had come. Jake didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, he didn't mention the incident to the others. As they loaded their gear into the car, he glanced nervously at the fresh snow around the motel. No footprints. The drive home was tense. Every now and then, someone would glance out the window, as if expecting to see something lurking along the road. They didn't talk about what had happened, not even after they made it back to their separate homes. 2 weeks later, Jake tried to move on. He avoided reading about the forest and brushed off his memories as his imagination playing tricks. But one evening, as he scrolled through his phone, a notification popped up, shared album updated. It was Emma, uploading pictures from their trip. Jake clicked on the album, scrolling through photos of snowy trails, their campfire, and the group smiling awkwardly in layers of winter gear. But as he swiped, he froze. One picture, taken by Lisa, showed the group standing near their tents. Behind them, deep in the trees, was a figure. It was blurred, distant, but unmistakably the same height and shape as what they'd seen in the clearing. Jake immediately called Emma, his voice shaking. "Did you see the last photo you uploaded?" "What are you talking about?" Emma sounded confused. Jake sent her a screenshot. A few minutes later, she called back. "I don't remember seeing that when I took the photo," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of us saw anything that night." Jake's stomach churned. "It's there," he said. It was there the whole time. The group never spoke of the trip again. They didn't return to the forest, didn't share the story with anyone else. But each of them, in their quiet moments, found themselves glancing over their shoulders, haunted by the feeling that whatever had watched them in the woods wasn't done watching. Would you like more added or a specific type of ending? The weeks passed, and the memory of the trip began to fade. Each of them found ways to rationalize what they'd seen. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, a strange optical illusion in the snow. The figure in the photo could have been another hiker, caught by coincidence at just the right angle. But none of them fully believed it. Jake couldn't shake the unease. He stopped camping altogether and avoided any mention of outdoors. Lisa became quieter, more withdrawn, and took up running, as if trying to outrun her own thoughts. Emma deleted the shared album entirely after seeing the figure in the photo. Tyler, the most skeptical of the group, brushed it off as paranoia but still began keeping a flashlight by his bed at night. Then, in late February, Jake received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Saw your post, same area?" At first, he thought it was spam. But when he opened it, his stomach dropped. Attached to the email was a single photo, taken in the same forest. The perspective was similar to where they had camped snow-covered trees in a clearing. In the center of the photo was the same figure they had seen, standing unnaturally still, its shape blurred but unmistakably tall and thin. The message that accompanied the photo was short. "This was taken last year. Did you hear it too?" Jake didn't respond. He closed his laptop and tried to forget, but the unease followed him like a shadow. By spring, the snow had melted, and the group had stopped talking altogether. Whatever had bonded them before had been replaced by an unspoken agreement to move on, to leave the experience buried in the past. But deep in the Colorado forest, the snow returned every winter, blanketing the ground, covering the footprints, and muffling the sounds. And whatever had been there that night watching, waiting remained. Mark and his cousin Alex had always been outdoor enthusiasts, drawn to the challenge of winter camping. This time, they decided to venture into the wilderness near a frozen lake deep in the Rocky Mountains. It was an area they had never visited before, chosen for its remoteness and the promise of untouched beauty. They started their hike early in the morning, the biting cold gnawing at their faces despite their thick scarves. By midday, they reached the lake, a vast expanse of ice stretching endlessly beneath a canopy of snow-laden pines. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the frozen water beneath their feet as they walked along the edge. "Perfect spot," Mark said, dropping his pack near a cluster of trees overlooking the lake. Alex nodded, his breath visible in the frigid air. They set up their tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal as the sun began to set. By the time night fell, the lake reflected the pale moonlight, casting an otherworldly glow over the clearing. The fire crackled softly, and the two men sat in silence, enjoying the tranquility. It was around 9 p.m. when they heard it. A sharp crack, like ice splintering. Mark froze, his ears straining to locate the source. "Probably just the lake settling," Alex said, though his voice carried an edge of doubt. But then it happened again, closer this time. Another crack, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible splash. "Did something fall in?" Mark asked, standing up. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the lake. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but the surface of the ice remained still. Alex shrugged. "Could be a branch breaking off and hitting the ice. Let's not overthink it." They decided to turn in for the night, the fire reduced to glowing embers. But Mark struggled to sleep. The silence of the forest, which had felt peaceful earlier, now seemed oppressive. He kept imagining the sound of the ice cracking, each one closer than the last. Sometime after midnight, he jolted awake. This time, it wasn't a crack, it was a faint but distinct noise, like something being dragged across the ice. "Alex," he whispered, shaking his cousin awake. "What?" Alex mumbled groggily. "Listen." They both held their breath. The dragging sound continued, slow and deliberate, before stopping abruptly. Mark unzipped the tent and peeked out. The moon was still high, illuminating the clearing and the lake. At first, he saw nothing unusual. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something near the far edge of the lake. A dark shape. It wasn't moving, but its outline was unnatural, too angular to be a tree or a rock. "Do you see that?" Mark whispered. Alex nodded, his face pale. "It's probably just something left behind. Maybe an old ice fishing shack or debris." But Mark wasn't convinced. "It wasn't there before," he said. They stayed up the rest of the night, huddled together in their tent, occasionally glancing toward the lake. By dawn, the shape was gone, leaving nothing but untouched snow in its place. As they packed up to leave, Alex stopped abruptly near the lake's edge. "Mark," he called, his voice shaking. Mark hurried over and followed Alex's gaze. In the snow, leading from the lake to the edge of the forest, were dragged Mark's long, uneven trails, as if something heavy had been pulled across the ice and into the trees. The two men didn't speak. They grabbed their gear and left as quickly as possible, the forest eerily silent around them. Mark and Alex trudged through the snow, their breath quickening with each step. They didn't dare speak, but both kept glancing over their shoulders, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The drag marks had unnerved them. They weren't random, whatever had made them had a purpose. And the shape on the ice wasn't something they could explain away anymore. By mid-morning, they reached the narrow trail that had led them to the lake. It felt safer somehow, with the tall pines crowding them on both sides, their heavy branches muffling every sound. Still, the silence was oppressive. Alex broke the quiet. "We should have stayed in the tent until daylight." His voice was low, almost apologetic. Mark shook his head. "And waited for whatever made those marks to come closer?" "No thanks." Alex didn't argue. The hike back to their car was supposed to take 3 hours, but it felt endless. They pushed forward, the weight of their gear pressing into their shoulders and the unease pressing into their minds. About halfway down the trail, they found themselves at a clearing where the snow was thinner. Alex stopped suddenly and grabbed Mark's arm. "Look." Mark followed his gaze. There, just ahead of them, was a fresh set of footprints. They were human-sized, barefoot, and spaced far apart, as if whoever or whatever had made them was running. The trail led off the path and into the dense forest. "No way," Mark muttered, shaking his head. "No one's out here without shoes. Not in this cold." Alex bent down to inspect the prints. "They're fresh. They weren't here when we passed through yesterday." Mark's pulse quickened. "Let's keep moving." They hurried on, but now every rustle of wind in the trees felt like something creeping up behind them. Mark kept his hand on the knife strapped to his belt, and Alex gripped the walking stick he'd found earlier. The footprints appeared again about a mile further, crossing the trail and heading toward the direction they were walking. "Are they circling us?" Alex asked, his voice tight. Mark didn't answer. He just picked up the pace. When they finally reached the car, they didn't even bother loading their gear properly. They threw their packs into the trunk, slammed the doors, and locked them immediately. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling, and started the engine. The tires crunched over the icy road as they sped away from the trailhead. Back in town. The drive home was silent, both men too shaken to speak. When they reached Alex's house, he turned to Mark. "You think it was a person?" Alex asked finally. Mark gripped the steering wheel. "If it was, they weren't normal." Alex nodded slowly. "What about the drag marks?" Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. That night, Mark lay awake in his apartment, replaying the events in his mind. Around midnight, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Alex. "Check your pack." Mark frowned and got out of bed, grabbing his pack from where he'd tossed it by the door. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then he noticed something shoved into one of the side pockets. It was a small piece of ice, wrapped in a torn scrap of fabric. The ice was smooth, almost glass-like, and inside it was something dark, a frozen insect or leaf, he couldn't tell. Mark's stomach churned. He didn't remember putting it there. Another buzz from Alex. "Found the same thing in mine." "What does it mean?" Mark didn't reply. He placed the ice on the counter and stared at it, his unease growing. He hadn't thought it was possible, but now he felt it. Whatever had been out there, it had followed them. Mark sat in the dark kitchen, staring at the piece of ice on the counter. The smooth surface shimmered faintly under the overhead light, and the dark shape inside seemed to shift when he turned his head. His phone buzzed again. "Alex, what should we do?" Mark didn't reply immediately. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ice wasn't just a strange souvenir. It was a message or a warning. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft, rhythmic sound outside. A faint crunching, like footsteps on snow. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he stood and moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The street below was empty, blanketed in a thin layer of frost. The faint yellow glow of the streetlights revealed nothing unusual. But the sound continued, closer now. Crunch, crunch. It was coming from the side of the building, near the alley. Mark grabbed his phone, turning on the flashlight as he cautiously peeked through the curtains. The beam of light illuminated the alley for only a moment before he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the light, its shape obscured but unmistakably tall. Mark stumbled back, his heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, as if waiting. His phone buzzed again. "Alex, it's outside my place too." Mark's hands shook as he texted back, "Stay inside. Don't open the door." He turned off the flashlight and crept to the front door, making sure the lock was secure. The footsteps outside had stopped, but the silence felt heavier than before. Then came the knock. A slow, deliberate thud, thud, thud. Mark backed away from the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No response. He glanced at the piece of ice on the counter. The dark shape inside now looked more defined, almost like. Mark's phone buzzed again, startling him. It was another message from Alex. "Alex, Mark, I think it's angry. The ice is melting." Mark looked at the counter. Sure enough, water was pooling around the ice, the dark shape inside becoming more visible. It wasn't an insect or a leaf. It looked like a small, shriveled hand. The knocking stopped. Mark felt the silence press down on him like a weight. Then, from outside, he heard a voice. "Mark." It was Alex's voice, but distorted, like it was coming from a bad recording. "Mark. Open the door." Mark's blood ran cold. He stared at his phone. The real Alex was still texting him, begging him to respond. Whatever was outside wasn't his cousin. The voice called again, louder this time. Mark. Let me in. Mark didn't move. He stayed frozen until the voice stopped and the faint crunch of footsteps retreated into the distance. The next morning, when daylight finally broke, Mark and Alex met at a diner, their faces pale and drawn. Both had barely slept. Alex pulled something from his pocket and placed it on the table, a shard of ice, almost identical to the one Mark had found. "What do we do with them?" Alex asked. Mark shook his head. "I don't know. But I think we weren't supposed to leave that place. It followed us because we broke some kind of rule." Alex stared at the shard, his expression grim. "Then we need to go back." Mark's stomach twisted at the thought of returning to the lake, but he couldn't deny it. Whatever had followed them, whatever had left those marks in the snow, wouldn't stop until they made it right. Mark and Alex agreed to return to the lake. They packed quickly, bringing only the essentials: warm clothing, flashlights, and a small propane heater. Both carried the shards of ice in sealed containers, unsure of what they represented but certain they were important. By the time they reached the trailhead, dusk was falling. The same oppressive silence from their previous trip returned, pressing down on them as they made their way toward the lake. Neither spoke much during the hike, their nerves on edge. Every crunch of snow underfoot felt unnaturally loud. As they approached the lake, the moonlight reflected off the frozen surface, just as it had days before. When they reached the clearing, they saw them drag marks, leading from the far edge of the lake to the forest. But this time there was more. Scattered across the ice were dozens of shards, glinting in the pale light. Each one was smooth and clear, with dark shapes frozen inside. What is this?" Alex whispered, his breath visible in the cold. Mark didn't answer. Instead, he stepped cautiously onto the ice, holding the container with the shard they'd brought. The surface creaked beneath his weight, but it held. As he moved toward the center of the lake, the air grew colder. It was more than the temperature; it felt like something was draining the warmth from his body. "Mark, stop," Alex called from the edge of the ice. But Mark didn't stop. He reached the center of the lake and knelt, placing the shard gently on the surface. Alex hesitated for a moment before joining him, adding his shard next to Mark's. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ice beneath them began to glow faintly, as if illuminated from within. The shards they'd placed melted instantly, leaving no trace. A low, resonant sound echoed across the clearing, vibrating through the ice. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, primal, and filled with an unspoken command: leave. Mark and Alex scrambled off the ice, the glow fading behind them. As they reached the shore, the wind picked up, scattering snow across the surface of the lake and erasing the drag marks. The oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the natural sounds of the forest branches creaking, distant animal calls, the rustle of wind. They didn't speak until they were back at the car. "Do you think it's over?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. Mark stared at the forest behind them, the trees now shrouded in darkness. "I don't know," he said, "but I'm not coming back to find out." Epilogue. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. The strange events faded into memory, but neither Mark nor Alex ever set foot in the wilderness again. One day, Mark received an email from an anonymous sender. The subject line read, "Did you fix it?" There was no text in the email, only a single attachment. It was a photo of the lake, taken at night. In the center of the ice stood a figure, tall and motionless, its face obscured by shadow. Mark deleted the email without opening the photo again. Some questions, he decided, were better left unanswered. Valerie and Alan had long dreamed of a winter camping trip. They loved nature and decided to try something new, spending a couple of days in the forest during the cold season, far from civilization. The goal was simple: disconnect from the world, enjoy the silence, and breathe in the fresh air. They carefully planned the trip, buying the right gear, checking the weather forecast, and choosing a spot near a forest cabin where they could set up camp. They arrived at the end of the day when the sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, and the forest was filled with shadows. A cold wind blew down from the mountains, and the snow crunched underfoot with every step. The forest looked magical: trees covered in snow, the air crisp and clear, and all sounds seemed to vanish into the stillness. They quickly set up the tent, arranged their sleeping bags, and built a fire. Both of them were prepared for the cold, but the wind and temperatures in the forest felt much colder than they had expected. Occasionally, the wind howled so fiercely that it seemed as though the tent could be blown away. "Are you sure this was a good idea?" asked Alan, as they sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets. "Yeah, it'll be fine. Just need to get used to the cold." "Tomorrow will be fun," replied Valerie, trying to stay optimistic. That evening, everything was calm. Only the wind occasionally whistled between the trees. But later, when Valerie went into the tent and asked if Alan had heard what she had, Alan noticed a strange noise, almost like the crunching of snow near the tent. At first, he didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just the wind or animals, but then the sound repeated itself. Valerie was worried. "Are you sure it's just a forest animal?" she asked, feeling uneasy. "Yeah, it's probably just a deer or rabbit," said Alan, trying to calm her down. "We know there are a lot of them around here." But neither of them could shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. They zipped up the tent and went to sleep. However, in the middle of the night, the sound repeated. It seemed much closer now. Alan went outside to check. He immediately noticed something several steps from the tent were tracks. They were large, almost human-sized, but led to an open field where the snow was undisturbed. "It's probably just another camper, checking out our tent," Alan said. But Valerie wasn't so sure. "I don't like this place. Maybe we should head back?" she asked, feeling that something wasn't right. They decided to stay another night. Although the uneasy feeling never left them, the next morning they woke up to find the tracks had disappeared, as if whatever had left them had vanished into the vast, snowy wilderness. The next morning, Valerie and Alan packed up their things, eager to move on from the strange events of the night before. The sun had risen, casting a pale glow over the snowy landscape, and the forest seemed peaceful once again. But the air was still bitterly cold, and the wind hadn't let up. As they walked away from their campsite, Valerie couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching them from the shadows. They decided to head deeper into the forest, hoping to distract themselves from the unsettling feeling. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way through the trees, the sound echoing eerily in the stillness. Alan was trying to keep up the conversation, talking about their plans for the evening and what they would do when they returned to the cabin, but Valerie remained quiet. Her thoughts were elsewhere, her mind replaying the strange tracks they had found and the way they had disappeared so suddenly. "Valerie, look," Alan said, pointing ahead. "I think there's a clearing up ahead. Let's head there. Maybe we'll catch a glimpse of something interesting." They reached the clearing, and as they looked around, something caught their eye, shiny, metallic objects glinting in the sunlight. A few steps further, they found a forgotten campsite. The remnants of a campfire were still visible, surrounded by old logs and what appeared to be abandoned Gear A tent, a rucksack, and some hiking poles. "Looks like someone else was here," Alan said, his voice low. Valerie stepped closer to the tent. It looked weathered and covered in a layer of frost, but the zipper was still intact. She hesitated for a moment before pulling it open. Inside, it was empty except for a few scattered belongings, as if the campers had left in a hurry. A jacket was left behind, and a half-filled water bottle lay on the ground. Valerie's heart raced. There was no sign of life, no footprints leading away from the tent. "This is strange," Valerie said. She glanced over at Alan. Why would they leave everything behind like this? Before Alan could respond, a loud rustling noise came from behind them. They both spun around, but there was nothing there, only the silent, snow-covered woods stretching out in every direction. "Maybe it's just a wild animal," Alan suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Valerie didn't reply. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she had a strong sense that something was wrong, something beyond the ordinary. The feeling that they were being watched had returned. But this time, it wasn't just a sense, it was real. Suddenly, the distant crackling of a fire broke the eerie silence, coming from deeper in the forest. It was faint, but enough to make them both freeze in place. "Someone's out there," Alan said, his voice trembling slightly. Valerie nodded, her pulse quickening. It didn't feel right, though. The campfire, the abandoned campsite, and now this. They needed to get back to the cabin, where they'd be safe. But as they turned to leave, the wind shifted, carrying with it a low, guttural growl. It was too deep to be any animal they had heard before. "Alan, let's go. Now," Valerie whispered urgently. Without another word, they turned and started running through the snow, their breath coming in quick gasps. They didn't dare look back. The distant growl continued to follow them, growing louder and more menacing, but they didn't stop until they reached the cabin. They slammed the door shut behind them, locking it tight. Inside, they could hear the wind howling and the occasional creaking of the wood, but the sound of the growl had stopped. They were safe, for now, but neither of them spoke of what had happened. Neither of them dared to mention the tracks again. They had been out there, far from civilization, and had experienced something they could not explain. For the rest of their stay, Valerie and Alan remained inside, the warmth of the cabin a stark contrast to the cold wilderness outside. The forest had felt alive, too alive for comfort, and they both knew they'd never forget the strange encounter in the depths of the winter woods. That night, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin windows. Valerie and Alan sat in silence, occasionally glancing at the fireplace as if its warmth could offer them more than just physical comfort. The tension in the air was thick, and neither of them could sleep. Alan finally broke the silence. "Do you think we should tell someone about what happened?" he asked, his voice quiet. Valerie shook her head, her gaze fixed on the crackling fire. "Who would believe us? A strange campsite, growls in the woods, and those tracks." It's too much. She didn't want to admit it, but she was terrified. Something out there in the forest didn't want them to leave. They had felt it, and even now, sitting safely inside, it lingered in her mind. The storm raged on through the night, but by morning, the winds had calmed. The snow had stopped falling, and the forest outside looked serene, almost peaceful. But Valerie wasn't fooled. The silence was suffocating, and something still felt wrong. "Let's pack up and leave," Valerie suggested firmly, glancing out the window. "We've seen enough." Alan nodded, relieved to be done with the unsettling experience. Together, they packed up their gear quickly, not speaking much. Neither wanted to dwell on what they had encountered. As they prepared to leave, Valerie took one last look around the cabin. Then, as she turned to step outside, her foot brushed something on the floor. She bent down to pick it up, a small, half-buried object. It was a broken compass, the needle stuck in a permanent, unyielding position. It looked old, the metal tarnished with age. She held it in her hand for a moment before tossing it into the trash. Outside, the forest was still, the snow untouched except for their footprints. Valerie glanced over her shoulder one last time, her heart racing. For the briefest moment, she thought she saw movement among the trees, a shadow darting from behind one of the thick trunks. But when she blinked, it was gone. "Let's go," she said softly. They left without looking back. As they made their way down the narrow path toward the main road, the woods seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the tension lifting from the air. When they finally reached the car and drove away, the distant peaks of the forest faded into the rearview mirror. Valerie and Alan didn't speak much during the drive, both lost in their own thoughts. They never spoke of what happened again. The winter wilderness remained a mystery, and the strange growl they had heard in the forest never left their minds. But they knew one thing for certain: some places were better left unexplored, some mysteries were better left unsolved. And as the car disappeared down the mountain road, they both realized they would never go camping in the winter again.